The grand hall of Aith stretched so far that the ceiling seemed to dissolve into a haze of pale light, where thin bands of energy drifted like slow-moving auroras. Crystal pillars rose in long, graceful lines, each one threaded with faint currents of blue luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with the city's power grid. Beyond the transparent upper vault, the night sky shimmered with orbital stations and distant traffic, small ships crossing the darkness like silent sparks. Rows of delegates, officers, scholars, and dignitaries filled the hall, their garments reflecting the colors of dozens of worlds. The air carried the soft hum of translation drones and the faint scent of aromatic resins, burned in floating glass spheres that drifted gently above the crowd. Every movement seemed measured, ceremonial, as if the hall itself demanded restraint. Corporal Isaac Ward stood among the line of decorated soldiers near the far side of the chamber. His uniform was immaculate, pressed so sharply that the seams looked carved rather than stitched. The metal pinned to his chest gleamed under the light, but he did not look at it. He did not look at anything for long. Around him, voices murmured in low tones. A pair of officers nearby whispered about the ceremony, speculating on how long it would last. One of them, a broad-shouldered engineer from a mining colony, leaned toward the other and muttered that the last commendation ceremony had lasted so long, he had grown a beard waiting for the speeches to end. His companion, who already had a beard impressive enough to shelter small wildlife, whispered back that this was unfair competition. The two struggled not to laugh, their shoulders shaking slightly as they stared rigidly forward, pretending perfect discipline. Isaac heard none of it, or perhaps he heard it without truly listening. Sound reached him as if from very far away, filtered through a heavy, invisible curtain. At the far end of the hall, the queen sat upon her elevated seat. Virilyn appeared, at first glance, almost human. Her face was composed and calm, her posture effortless, her expression attentive as she listened to the formal address of the High Chancellor. Only her ears marked her as different, long and finely shaped, extending gracefully behind her head, their edges catching the light like pale ivory. They moved subtly, almost imperceptibly, responding to sounds too faint for others to notice. She listened to the speech, but her thoughts drifted, slipping between the Chancellor's carefully measured phrases. She had attended hundreds of ceremonies. She knew every step of the ritual, every pause, every turn of phrase that would be spoken before the evening ended. Yet tonight something pressed at her awareness, something she had felt the moment she entered the hall. Her gaze shifted almost unconsciously until it found the line of soldiers. And then it stopped. Isaac stood motionless, eyes forward, face expressionless. To anyone else, he might have appeared composed, even stoic. But Virilyn had seen too many soldiers to mistake that stillness. It was not calm, it was absence. The Chancellor concluded a paragraph that had taken so long to reach its point that several listeners quietly activated the time displays in their sleeves. One young diplomat leaned toward another and whispered that, if the speech lasted much longer, the orbital stations might complete another full rotation before the applause began. The diplomat beside him bit her lip to keep from laughing and ended up coughing instead, which she then had to disguise as a dignified clearing of the throat. Polite applause followed the Chancellor's words, rolling across the hall like a distant tide. Virilyn inclined her head, acknowledging the speech, but her attention remained fixed on the silent human soldier. She remembered fire. The memory rose without warning, a sky choked with smoke, the scream of engines straining beyond safe limits, the desperate press of civilians crowding the loading ramp of an evacuation craft. She remembered the heat against her skin, the weight of command, the knowledge that every second meant lives saved or lost. And she remembered one figure standing alone at the edge of the landing field, holding the line long after retreat had become impossible. The present returned in a quiet rush of sound, the murmur of the hall, the soft resonance of distant machinery, the faint chime of a hovering recorder drone adjusting its position. Virilyn drew a slow breath, steadying herself. Names were being called now, one by one. Soldiers stepped forward, received their commendations, bowed, and returned to their places. The ritual unfolded with precise elegance, every motion practiced, every gesture observed by hundreds of eyes. Isaac remained still. A young attendant near the dais shifted nervously, nearly dropping the ceremonial staff he carried. The staff emitted a soft warning tone as it detected the sudden tilt, which caused the attendant to fumble even more in his attempt to silence it. The faint electronic chirping echoed embarrassingly in the quiet hall until he finally managed to steady the device. A few nearby guards exchanged brief, sympathetic smiles. Even in solemn halls, small moments of humanity found their way through. At last, the herald's voice rang clear. "Corporal Isaac Ward." Isaac stepped forward. His boots echoed softly against the polished floor as he crossed the vast space. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, each step distinct, each movement watched by hundreds of silent observers. He stopped at the appointed mark and stood at attention. The herald recited the formal citation, his voice steady, recounting the evacuation of Orphean Colony, the defense of the civilian transports, the survival of over 3,000 lives. The words were precise, honorable, carefully measured. They did not speak of the squad that had not returned. They did not speak of the silence that had followed. Isaac accepted the medal placed in his hand. He did not bow as deeply as some, nor as briefly as others. He simply inclined his head, then straightened. For a moment, nothing moved. Then he turned to return to his place, and at that exact moment, Virilyn rose. The movement was small, almost delicate, yet it rippled through the grand hall like a shockwave. Queens did not rise in the middle of a commendation unless something extraordinary had occurred. Conversations faltered. The hum of translator drones seemed to soften, as if even the machines sensed the shift. Virilyn descended the first step of the dais. Isaac stopped where he was, his back still turned, the metal cold in his hand. He did not move, but a faint tension passed through his shoulders, the subtle awareness of someone who sensed attention gathering behind him. The chief chamberlain blinked twice, certain he must have misunderstood what he was seeing. He leaned toward the high chancellor and whispered something urgently. The chancellor, who had been preparing to signal the next name, followed the chamberlain's gaze and nearly dropped the ceremonial tablet in his hands. Virilyn continued walking. Her steps were unhurried, measured, the long folds of her pale robes gliding silently across the floor. The hall seemed to stretch endlessly between her and the solitary human soldier, every eye fixed on the distance, closing one step at a time. A young cadet standing in the second row leaned slightly toward his friend and whispered, barely moving his lips, "Is this part of the ceremony?" His friend whispered back, "If it is, no one told the ceremony." The cadet almost smiled, then forced his face back into solemn stillness. Isaac turned slowly. For the first time, his eyes met hers. The hall seemed to fade, the countless observers dissolving into a blur of color and distant light. Virilyn saw the exhaustion in his gaze, the hollow stillness that lived behind it, and beneath that, something deeper, a wound that had never been given space to heal. She stopped an arm's length from him. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she stepped forward and embraced him. A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. The sound was soft, yet unmistakable, like the sudden rush of wind before a storm. Isaac stiffened at first, his body caught between instinct and disbelief. Physical contact with the queen was forbidden without explicit permission. Every soldier in the hall knew it. Every court official knew it. Every citizen of Aith knew it. And yet her arms remained around him, steady and unyielding. He felt the warmth of another living presence, the simple human reality of it, and something inside him trembled. Not fear, but the fragile edge of something long buried. Her voice came softly, meant only for him. "I know," she whispered. "I was there." The words struck like a distant echo returning at last. Isaac's breath caught. For months the memories had lived inside him without witness, without language, as if the truth of that day existed only in his own mind. And now suddenly, someone else carried it too. Around them the silence stretched, fragile and electric. The chief chamberlain made a strangled noise that sounded like a kettle beginning to boil. One of the court scribes, startled by the sound, accidentally dropped a stylus, which bounced once on the polished floor and slid in a slow, humiliating arc until it tapped gently against the boot of a very stern-looking admiral. The admiral stared down at it, then at the scribe, and quietly nudged it back with the tip of his foot, as if pretending none of this was happening. Virilyn released Isaac, but she did not step back immediately. She looked at him, not as a queen to a soldier, but as one witness to another. Isaac's hands trembled slightly. He lowered his gaze, struggling to steady his breathing. The hall began to return to focus around him. The towering pillars, the watching faces, the vast weight of attention pressing in from all sides. A murmur began, faint at first, then growing. The High Chancellor leaned toward the Chamberlain and whispered urgently, "Is this allowed?" The Chamberlain whispered back, "No." They both stood very still. Some of the younger officers exchanged uncertain glances. A few looked moved, others confused, and one elderly general simply nodded slowly, as if recognizing something that needed no explanation. Isaac remained where he stood, the medal still in his hand. For months he had existed in a world muffled and distant, where words felt heavy and useless. Now standing in the center of the grand hall with hundreds of eyes upon him, he felt something shifting inside, a faint, fragile stirring, like the first movement of air after a long, suffocating stillness. Virilyn turned, ascending the steps of the dais once more. The ceremony resumed, though nothing felt the same. The herald's voice sounded slightly uncertain as he called the next name, and the applause that followed was scattered, distracted, as if the hall itself were still trying to understand what had just occurred. Isaac returned to his place among the soldiers. One of them, a tall mechanic from the outer fleets, leaned very slightly toward him and whispered, "Well, that's never happened before." Isaac did not reply, but for the first time in many months, the corner of his mouth moved. Just barely, the faintest trace of something that might, one day, become a smile. Above the hall, the stars continued their silent movement, indifferent to ceremonies, to protocol, to the quiet turning of a human heart finding its way back from silence. The ceremony ended, but the silence it left behind did not fade. It followed the guests as they moved through the immense corridors of the palace, whispering between the arches, echoing faintly in the long galleries where starlight filtered through transparent walls. Conversations resumed, but every voice seemed to carry the same question beneath it. Why had the queen done it? Isaac walked with the other soldiers toward the outer wing, his steps steady but distant, as if part of him were still standing in the grand hall. The polished floors reflected the ceiling's shifting constellations, projections of real star maps slowly rotating above them. One of the younger soldiers stared upwards so long that he nearly walked straight into a decorative pillar shaped like a spiral of crystal. The dull thump of the collision echoed, followed by several suppressed laughs, including one from a passing maintenance drone that emitted a sound uncannily similar to a chuckle before resuming its quiet glide. The moment passed, light and ordinary, yet Isaac felt strangely aware of it, as if the world were returning in fragments. At the far end of the corridor, tall windows opened onto the city of Aith. The capital spread in vast terraces of silver and glass, traffic lanes glowing in slow arcs as transport craft moved in silent currents between towers. Above it all, the orbital ring shone like a pale halo, its massive structure catching the light of the distant sun. Isaac paused briefly near the window. He did not know why. Perhaps it was the memory of another sky, another horizon filled not with ordered lights, but with fire and falling debris. He closed his eyes for a moment. The sound came first, as it always did. The distant thunder of collapsing structures, the roar of engines pushed beyond safety limits, the urgent voices shouting coordinates and casualty numbers. Then came the image. Civilians running, the heat against his skin, the taste of smoke. He opened his eyes again, breathing slowly, forcing the memory back into the place where it usually remained, buried and silent. "Corporal Ward," he turned. A palace attendant stood a short distance away, hands clasped respectfully. "Her Majesty requests your presence?" Several nearby soldiers glanced toward Isaac, curiosity flickering openly now. One of them, the tall mechanic who had whispered to him earlier, raised his eyebrows in exaggerated astonishment and mouthed, "Again!" before catching himself and standing rigidly at attention when the attendant noticed him. Isaac followed without speaking. They passed through a series of corridors that grew quieter and less ornate. the distant hum of the city fading behind layers of insulated walls. Here the lighting was softer, the architecture more functional, designed for thought rather than display. Thin streams of data flowed across translucent panels embedded in the walls, updating in real time with reports from distant systems, navigation routes, supply manifests, weather patterns on worlds hundreds of light years away. At last they reached a wide chamber open to the sky. The ceiling here was not solid, but a field of transparent energy, allowing the stars to be seen clearly. The air carried a faint coolness, scented with night-blooming plants arranged in low terraces around the room. A small fountain stood at the center, its water held in place by a gentle gravitational field, forming a sphere that rotated slowly, reflecting starlight in shifting patterns across the walls. Virilyn stood near the edge of the chamber, looking out over the city. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Isaac remained near the entrance, uncertain whether to approach. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy, filled with things that could not easily be said. At last she turned. "You remember the evacuation," she said quietly. It was not a question. Isaac's jaw tightened slightly. He nodded once. "I remember it too," she said. "Every detail." Her voice carried no ceremony now, no distance of rank or ritual. Only memory. For a long moment, they stood in silence again. The faint sound of the fountain's rotating water, the only movement in the room. A small service drone drifted quietly across the chamber, carrying a tray of steaming cups. It hesitated in midair, as if uncertain whether to interrupt, then cautiously extended the tray toward Isaac. He stared at it for a moment, unsure what to do, until Virilyn said, with the faintest trace of amusement, "It will remain there until you take one. They are very patient, but not very subtle." Isaac reached out and took a cup. The drone emitted a soft tone that sounded suspiciously like satisfaction and floated away. The warmth of the drink in his hands felt strangely grounding. "You held the line longer than anyone expected," Virilyn said. "Long enough for 3,000 people to live?" Isaac stared into the cup, watching the thin spiral of steam rise and vanish into the cool air. "And your squad?" she asked gently. His hand tightened slightly around the cup. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that waits, not demanding words, only allowing them if they come. At last, Isaac spoke. His voice was rough, unused, barely more than a whisper. "They knew." The words seemed to surprise even him. He swallowed, then added, "We all knew." Virilyn inclined her head, understanding without needing further explanation. Far below, the lights of the city shimmered, countless lives moving in quiet patterns, unaware of the two figures standing beneath the open sky. Isaac drew a slow breath. For the first time since Orpheon, the silence inside him no longer felt endless. The night deepened over Aith, and the stars above the open chamber shifted slowly as the orbital lanes adjusted. Distant traffic gliding in silent arcs across the darkness. The faint hum of the palace systems was almost soothing, like the breathing of some enormous, patient creature. Isaac stood near the edge of the terrace, the warm cup still in his hands, though the drink had long since cooled. Speaking even a few words had left him strangely tired, as if he had used muscles long forgotten. Yet the exhaustion was not unpleasant. It carried a quiet sense of release, like the stillness after a storm has finally passed. Virilyn watched the city for a time before speaking again. "Do you know," she said softly, "that the evacuation craft you helped fill is still in service?" Isaac glanced at her, surprised. "It was repaired," she continued. "The engineers insisted on keeping the scorch marks on the hull. They said it reminded them what ships are for." A faint sound escaped Isaac, almost a breath of laughter, rough and unfamiliar. The idea of engineers choosing not to polish something seemed absurdly out of character. Virilyn noticed the sound and allowed herself a small smile. "Yes," she said, "I had the same reaction." The quiet between them felt different now, less fragile. Below, a stream of small courier vessels passed in precise formation, their navigation lights blinking in slow, synchronized patterns. One of them drifted slightly out of alignment, corrected itself, then drifted again, as if distracted. A moment later, a faint burst of static crackled over the open channel receiver near the terrace, followed by a very apologetic voice explaining to traffic control that the autopilot had attempted to follow a migrating flock of atmospheric survey drones, mistakenly identifying them as navigation beacons. The control officer's weary reply echoed faintly through the receiver. For the last time, please recalibrate your pattern recognition software. Isaac found himself smiling, just slightly but without effort. Silence returned, gentle and unforced. At last, Virilyn said, "There will be questions tomorrow." Isaac nodded. He had expected as much. The court would not let the moment in the hall pass without examination. Protocol, tradition, reputation, these things mattered deeply to those who lived within the machinery of governance. "Some will be angry," she said. "Some will say I acted improperly." Isaac looked at her, and for the first time there was something steady in his gaze, something no longer entirely shadowed by memory. "They weren't there," he said quietly. The words came more easily now, though his voice still carried the roughness of disuse. Virilyn inclined her head. "No, they were not." A faint breeze moved across the terrace, stirring the leaves of the night plants. Somewhere in the palace, a distant chime marked the passing of the hour. "Why did you do it?" Isaac asked after a moment. It was a simple question, but not an easy one. Virilyn considered it, her eyes reflecting the distant lights of the city. "Because," she said slowly, "I was tired of watching people carry invisible wounds while others applauded medals." Isaac looked down at the one pinned to his uniform. "It is not a lie," she said gently. "You deserve it. But it is not the whole truth." He exhaled slowly. "No," he said. For a time, neither of them spoke. A small maintenance drone floated onto the terrace, humming softly as it scanned the fountain. It paused, rotated, and projected a tiny holographic checklist in the air. After several seconds, it emitted a sharp, indignant beep and extended a slender manipulator to retrieve a leaf that had drifted into the suspended sphere of water. The leaf was lifted with great ceremony, then deposited into a waste compartment with the solemnity of a sacred ritual. The drone hovered a moment longer, as if expecting applause, then drifted away. Isaac watched it go. "It takes its job seriously," he said. "Extremely," Virilyn replied. "Last week, one of them attempted to file a maintenance report on a sculpture because it believed the artist had installed the arm at an inefficient angle." Isaac let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. The sound lingered in the air, light but real. Far beyond the palace, a distant flash marked the departure of a jump-capable vessel entering faster than light transit. The brief distortion shimmered across the sky like a ripple through glass, then vanished, leaving the stars steady once more. Isaac followed the fading glow with his eyes. "Do you ever wish," he said slowly, "that you could just leave? Take a ship and go somewhere no one knows your name?" Virilyn looked at him, considering. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that there are people here who cannot leave. And if I go, who stands for them?" Isaac nodded. He understood that answer. The quiet stretched again, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt open. At last, Virilyn said, "You spoke tonight." Isaac looked at her, surprised. "Not in the hall," she said, "but here. That matters." He considered this, then nodded once. "I think," she added, "that voices do not return all at once. They return the way dawn comes, slowly, almost unnoticed, until suddenly there is light." Isaac looked out over the city, where thousands of lights shimmered like stars fall into the surface of the world. For the first time since Orpheon, he felt something unfamiliar but welcome stirring within him. Not joy, not yet, but the quiet possibility of it, distant as the first pale glow on the horizon. Morning came to Aith in slow gradients of silver and pale gold. The light of the rising sun filtered through the orbital ring so that the city seemed to awaken beneath a luminous veil. Traffic lanes brightened, towers reflected the dawn, and across the palace complex the quiet rhythm of daily operations resumed. Drones gliding along maintenance routes, couriers delivering sealed data crystals, attendants moving through the halls with the calm precision of long practice. But beneath that ordinary rhythm ran an undercurrent of tension. News of the Queen's action in the Grand Hall had traveled faster than any official communique. By sunrise, fragments of the moment had already spread across half the system, recordings from discreet observers, descriptions passed through diplomatic channels, and, inevitably, wildly exaggerated retellings that grew more dramatic with every retelling. One particularly imaginative account claimed that Virilyn had leapt from the dais in a blaze of light and declared the abolition of all court protocol before carrying Isaac triumphantly through the hall. This version was so spectacularly inaccurate that even the commentators who disliked the Queen found themselves laughing while denying it. In the palace, however, the mood was less amused. Isaac stood in a quiet antechamber outside the council chamber, waiting. Two guards stood nearby, their expressions carefully neutral, though one of them occasionally glanced at Isaac with open curiosity. A small service drone hovered near the ceiling, projecting a silent news feed in miniature holographic text. The headlines scrolled endlessly, speculation layered upon speculation. Isaac did not read them. The doors to the council chamber opened, and an attendant gestured for him to enter. Inside, the chamber was vast but restrained, its curved walls lined with translucent panels showing distant stars and drifting clouds of interstellar dust. The council members sat in a wide semicircle, their expressions ranging from stern to openly disapproving. At the center stood Virilyn, composed and calm, her posture as steady as ever. The air felt heavy, as if charged with an approaching storm. One of the senior ministers, an older man with sharp features and a voice trained to carry across large rooms, spoke first. "Your Majesty, with respect, your actions yesterday have caused considerable concern. Protocol exists for a reason." Virilyn inclined her head slightly. "I am aware." "Then you must understand," the minister continued, "that such behavior risks undermining the dignity of the throne." A faint rustle of agreement moved through part of the chamber. Another counselor leaned forward. "We do not question your compassion, Your Majesty, but compassion must be balanced with order." Isaac stood near the entrance, silent, listening. The words sounded distant, like echoes in a long tunnel. He had heard arguments like this before, though in different forms, the endless weighing of principles against realities, of rules against lives. One of the younger council members shifted in his seat and whispered to the person beside him, not quite quietly enough, "I still think the Chamberlain's face was the most remarkable part of the whole event." The person beside him coughed sharply, trying to disguise a laugh, and the whispering ceased. Virilyn spoke at last. "Order exists to serve people," she said calmly, "not the other way around." A brief silence followed. The first minister frowned. "Even so, Your Majesty, the appearance of impropriety—" "The appearance," Virilyn said gently, "of acknowledging a truth that everyone preferred not to see." The minister hesitated. At that moment, Isaac stepped forward. Every eye in the chamber turned toward him. He could feel the weight of their attention, the expectation, the uncertainty. For months he had avoided attention, had shrunk from it, had hidden in silence because words felt impossible. But now something steadier moved within him. He did not speak. Instead, he reached up, unpinned the medal from his uniform, and placed it quietly on the central table. The faint metallic sound as it touched the surface seemed louder than any shout. The council members stared at it. Isaac met their gazes one by one. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a depth that needed no translation. The meaning was unmistakable. The medal honored an act. The Queen had honored the cost. Neither truth diminished the other. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, unexpectedly, one of the older counselors leaned back and exhaled slowly. "Well," he said almost to himself, "that is the most eloquent speech I have heard in years." A ripple of restrained amusement moved through the chamber, breaking the tension just enough for breath to return. The first minister looked at the medal, then at Isaac, then at Virilyn. The rigid certainty in his expression softened, though only slightly. At last he said, "It seems we may have been discussing the matter too narrowly." The storm in the room began, slowly, to dissipate. Outside the chamber, life in the palace continued as always. A delivery drone became hopelessly entangled in a decorative banner and had to be rescued by two laughing attendants. Somewhere in the distance, a musician practiced on a stringed instrument whose tones drifted faintly through the corridors, calm and unhurried. Inside, the council session ended, not with a decree or a reprimand, but with a quiet, thoughtful silence. Isaac retrieved his medal and fastened it back onto his uniform. As he turned to leave, Virilyn caught his eye and gave the smallest nod of gratitude, not as a queen to a subject, but as one witness to another. And for the first time since Orpheon, Isaac felt no weight pressing on his chest as he walked out into the light. In the days that followed, the palace settled into a new rhythm, though it was not quite the same as before. Conversations lingered longer in corridors. Officers who once passed each other with formal nods now paused to exchange real words, and the quiet rooms set aside for remembrance began to fill more often. Isaac found himself walking those corridors without quite knowing why. He had spent so many months avoiding people that the simple act of moving through the palace without purpose felt unfamiliar, almost strange. Yet no one stopped him. Some recognized him and inclined their heads respectfully. Others simply watched with a kind of thoughtful curiosity. One morning he wandered into a long observation gallery overlooking the shipyards that floated beyond the city's upper atmosphere. Through the vast transparent wall, dozens of vessels drifted in slow formation, repair crews moving across their hulls like small, patient insects. A massive carrier rotated gently, its surface still scarred in places where micrometeorite impacts had been patched but not polished. A pair of engineers stood nearby, arguing quietly. "I'm telling you," one insisted, pointing at a projected schematic, "if we reroute the stabilizer field through the auxiliary matrix, the fuel consumption drops by 12%. And I'm telling you," the other replied, "that if you do that, the navigation computer will think it's steering a loaf of bread." Isaac paused, listening. The engineers noticed him and fell silent for a moment. Then one of them said, "You're the soldier from the ceremony." Isaac nodded slightly. The engineer scratched the back of his neck. "Well, thank you," he said awkwardly, then gestured toward the shipyard. "Those people out there, some of them are alive because of you." Isaac did not know what to say, so he simply inclined his head and continued walking. But the words followed him, echoing faintly in his thoughts. Not as a burden, but as something steadier, something that no longer felt like a weight pressing down. Later that day, he found himself in the training courtyard, where new recruits practiced maneuvers under the watchful eyes of instructors. The rhythmic sound of boots striking the ground carried across the open space. One recruit, attempting an overly ambitious turn, misjudged his footing and spun completely around before collapsing in a heap. His instructor stared at him in silence for several seconds before saying, very calmly, "Remarkable. I have never seen that maneuver before. Please never perform it again." A few suppressed laughs broke out among the recruits, and even the fallen trainee grinned sheepishly as he scrambled to his feet. Isaac watched for a while, leaning against the railing. The ordinary clumsiness of it, the laughter, the lack of tragedy, it felt almost unreal, like watching a world he had once known but nearly forgotten. "Do you miss it?" a voice asked behind him. He turned. Virilyn stood a few steps away, dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in a simpler uniform suited for movement, the fabric dark and practical, her long ears visible where her hair was drawn back. "Training?" she clarified. Isaac considered. "Sometimes," he said. "Not the drills. The people." She nodded. "Yes." They stood side by side, watching the recruits. A small utility drone zipped low across the courtyard, carrying a crate of equipment, misjudged its altitude, and clipped the top of a training post with a hollow clunk. It paused mid-air, emitted a series of indignant beeps, and corrected its course with exaggerated precision, as if pretending nothing had happened. Several recruits exchanged glances, trying not to laugh. Virilyn allowed herself a quiet smile. "Even our machines have pride," she said. Isaac found himself smiling as well. After a time, they walked together along the shaded colonnade that bordered the courtyard. The air carried the faint scent of flowering vines that climbed the pillars, their pale blossoms glowing softly in the filtered sunlight. "There is something I wish to show you," Virilyn said. She led him through a series of corridors to a chamber deep within the palace. The room was circular, its walls lined with softly illuminated panels. At the center stood a holographic projector, its surface dark and still. Virilyn activated it. Light unfolded in the air, forming an image of the evacuation site on Orphean Colony. The landing field appeared in perfect detail. The shattered buildings, the columns of smoke, the desperate movement of civilians boarding the transport. Isaac felt his breath catch, but he did not look away. "This recording was taken from my craft," Virilyn said quietly. "I have watched it many times. Not to remember the destruction, but to remember what people did in the face of it." The image shifted, focusing on a group of soldiers holding the perimeter. Isaac saw himself among them, moving, shouting orders, guiding civilians forward. He watched the moment when the last transport lifted, the moment when the firestorm advanced, the moment when everything became noise and heat and chaos. Then the recording ended. The chamber fell silent. Isaac stood very still. The memory was no longer only inside his mind. It existed here, in light and motion, witnessed and preserved. "They were brave," Virilyn said softly. "Yes," Isaac replied. He did not need to say more. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, the quiet filled with understanding rather than absence. At last, Isaac said, "I used to think that surviving meant I had failed them." Virilyn looked at him. "And now?" He considered the question. "Now I think surviving means I carry them." She inclined her head. "Yes." As they left the chamber, the palace corridors seemed brighter somehow. The distant sounds of life, voices, footsteps, the hum of distant engines, carrying a warmth that had once felt unreachable. And Isaac realized that the silence inside him was no longer empty. It was becoming something else, a space where memory and life could exist together, without one destroying the other. The memorial plaza had never been used before. It lay at the highest level of the palace complex, open to the sky, its floor formed from a single expanse of pale stone, veined with faint threads of luminous crystal. Around the edges stood slender pillars, each one inscribed with names that shimmered softly as the morning light touched them. Above, the orbital ring traced a silent arc across the sky, and beyond it the stars were still visible in the fading night. People gathered slowly, not in rigid formation, but in quiet clusters: soldiers, engineers, attendants, council members, and civilians from the city below. The ceremony had not been announced with grand proclamations. Word had simply spread, carried in conversations and messages, until everyone who wished to come knew where to stand. Isaac stood near the center of the plaza, looking at the nearest pillar. The names carved there were not arranged by rank or origin, only by the order in which their lives had ended. He found the names he was searching for without difficulty. He had never forgotten them. For a time he simply stood there, breathing, the faint wind moving across the open space, carrying the distant sound of the city awakening. A small group of recruits stood nearby, whispering among themselves in nervous voices, uncertain how solemn they were expected to be. One of them shifted his weight too quickly and knocked over a ceremonial lantern that had not yet been activated. The lantern rolled in a slow circle before coming to rest against a pillar. The recruit froze, horrified, until an older sergeant picked it up, set it upright, and murmured, "Relax. If the fallen are watching, they're probably just glad you didn't trip over your own boots." A few quiet laughs broke the tension, and even the recruit managed a faint smile. Isaac heard the laughter and felt something ease in his chest. The world was still capable of lightness. It always had been, even in the worst moments. He simply had not been able to see it. Virilyn arrived without ceremony, walking among the gathered people rather than standing apart from them. Today she wore neither crown nor formal robes, only a simple uniform of dark fabric, the lines of it unadorned. Her long ears caught the light as she moved, and those who saw her stepped aside, not out of obligation, but out of quiet respect. She came to stand beside Isaac. For a while neither of them spoke. At last she said softly, "They would have been proud of you." Isaac looked at the names again. "I hope so," he said. "They would," she replied. The ceremony began not with speeches, but with silence. One by one, small hovering lights rose from the center of the plaza, drifting upward like slow, glowing embers. Each light carried a fragment of recorded memory. Laughter, voices, fragments of conversations preserved from ship's logs and personal archives. The sounds were faint, almost indistinct, but together they formed a quiet tapestry of life, reminding everyone present that the names on the pillars had once been voices, faces, stories. Isaac listened. For the first time, the memories did not feel like wounds reopening. They felt like echoes. Sorrowful, yes, but also warm, like distant music carried on the wind. When the last light had risen and vanished into the sky, Virilyn stepped forward. She did not address the crowd formally. She simply spoke, her voice calm and clear. "Tradition teaches us to honor victories," she said. "Today we honor truth. Not only the courage to act, but the courage to remember." There was no applause, only a deep, shared stillness. Afterward, people began to disperse slowly, speaking in low voices, some lingering by the pillars, others walking quietly back toward the city. The plaza emptied until only a few remained. Isaac stood at the edge, looking out over Aith. The sunlight now filled the sky, reflecting from towers and waterways, turning the entire city into a field of light. "You are leaving the palace," Virilyn said beside him. It was not a question. Isaac nodded. "I've been assigned to the transport corps. Civilian routes along the frontier." He hesitated, then added, "It feels right." She studied him for a moment. "You are not running away." "No," he said. "I'm moving forward." She smiled faintly. A courier drone approached, carrying a small sealed case. It hovered uncertainly between them, as if unsure who was meant to receive it, then rotated in a slow circle before finally extending the case toward Isaac. A small label blinked. "Delivery confirmed. Probably." Isaac took the case, and the drone emitted a cheerful chime before darting away at unnecessary speed, narrowly avoiding a pillar in its enthusiasm. He opened the case. Inside lay a small, polished fragment of dark metal, mounted on a simple frame. The surface was scorched, etched by heat and impact. A small inscription beneath it read, "Orphean Evacuation Craft, Whole Section 7. Isaac looked at Virilyn. "They replaced that section during the repairs," she said. "I thought you should have it." He ran his fingers lightly over the metal, feeling the faint ridges left by fire. For a moment he could almost hear the roar of engines again, but now the sound no longer filled him with helplessness. It reminded him of survival, of people saved, of lives continuing. "Thank you," he said quietly. They stood together for a while longer, watching the city. At last Isaac said, "You were right." "About what?" Voices returning slowly. She inclined her head. He looked out at the horizon, where the sky deepened into the pale blue of morning. Ships moved in distant lanes, their paths steady and purposeful, each one carrying people toward futures not yet written. "I think," Isaac said, "mine has returned." Virilyn smiled, and there was warmth in it, but also something like quiet pride. When he left the plaza, he did not look back immediately. He walked through the corridors of the palace with steady steps, past the observation galleries, the training courtyards, the quiet rooms where memories were kept. The world felt different now, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, as if a long storm had passed and the air had finally settled. At the shuttle port, a group of transport crew waited, checking cargo manifests and arguing amicably over navigation routes. One of them waved Isaac over and said, "You're just in time. We were about to flip a coin to decide who gets the worst shift, and I'm terrible at losing." Isaac almost laughed. He boarded the shuttle and took his seat by the viewport. As the engines engaged and the vessel lifted into the bright sky, he watched the palace recede, the city shrinking into patterns of light and motion. He did not feel the silence anymore. He felt the memory of voices, of laughter, of the quiet strength of those who had stood beside him. He carried them with him, not as a burden, but as a compass. And as the shuttle turned toward the stars, Isaac Ward finally felt, with calm certainty, that he was no longer a man defined by what he had lost, but by what he would choose to protect.